Good afternoon. It is Wednesday afternoon. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein, Valley Beth Shalom. This is Valley Beth Shalom live and online, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this afternoon's Lunch and Learn. I hope that you're taking very good care, and wherever you are, you're staying home and staying safe. And if you're out in the world, I hope that you'll be very, very careful during the day with all of the various kinds of demonstrations and unrest going on outside, in addition to the COVID-19 pandemic and the quarantines that we have suffered. I think the only thing left to wait for is frogs, falling down from the sky. So it's good to have you here. We're going to be looking again at the prophet Isaiah. So if you happen to have a Bible, open up to the book of Isaiah. It's the first of the books of classical prophets. It's in any good translation of the Bible. I've been using the JPS translation, and that's what I'll be reading. But you can find it in any good translation of the Bible. And if you can't find one and can't check into a hotel and steal one, then I'd suggest that you go online to Kindle and pick up a copy of the JPS Tanakh and join me in the book of Isaiah. Now, the book of Isaiah, as I pointed out some time ago, is an extensive book. It's a very, very long book. Contemporary scholarship believes that we have here three basic authors, perhaps more basic authors. We have three different periods of time when this book was put together under three different kinds of circumstances. The first is the first 39 chapters, which is called Isaiah 1, or the first Isaiah. That's what we'll be looking at today. The second, which is the middle part of the book, and the third, which is called Trito Isaiah, the third part of Isaiah, were written much later after the exile to Babylon and as the community was coming back together again. Our first Isaiah begins his career in the year 740 BCE. He lives in Jerusalem. He lives in the southern kingdom. The southern kingdom was ruled for 50 years by a very clever king named Uzziah. And Uzziah was a very stable and wise and powerful king, and was able in his time to bring the southern kingdom to a position of some prosperity and some security. And for 50 years, the kingdom lived with that prosperity, not like the prosperity of the north. The north was much, much more prosperous, but the south enjoyed good relations, good trading relations with the other areas of the Middle East. Jerusalem becomes a caravan depot, a caravan stop for caravans spreading all over the east. And the kingdom enjoys a sort of time of prosperity, peace, and goodwill. In the last years of Uzziah's life, he is stricken with leprosy, or whatever passes for leprosy in that world, and has to spend his last years in a leper colony outside of the city. And his son, whose name is Yotam, becomes the regent. And then upon Uzziah's death, his son Yotam becomes the king. Now, you'll remember from our first episode, that the book of Isaiah is an odd book because the first 5 chapters are various prophecies, and it's only in chapter 6 that the book really begins. And if you remember how chapter 6 begins, if you have it, you can look it up. He begins by saying, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I beheld my Lord seated on a high and lofty throne." So Isaiah's prophecy begins on that year that Uzziah dies. And Uzziah's death shook the kingdom, because the man had been king for 50 years, for more than a generation, as it were. And his stability and his wisdom and the security that he brought the kingdom and the prosperity he brought the kingdom were prized by the people of Judea. And when Yotam becomes king, he doesn't have any of his father's qualities. And so there is a distinct sense of instability. A distinct sense of instability in the air. And that's reflected in Isaiah's chapter 6. That with the death of Uzziah, there is a sense that the world is shaking. And I think today all of us can feel that. We certainly feel like something is shaking. I guess I shouldn't say that, because we live in an earthquake zone here in Southern California, and that's the last thing that we need right now. But that sense that it's not nailed down. There have been certain moments, I think some of us who are old enough can remember, for example, 1968, 1969. Many of us can remember 9/11, 2001, when the sense that who you thought you were and the world you thought you lived in shifted. And there was a sense that our security was not nailed down. It was not secure. There was sort of nothing to hold on to. There was a terrible sense of social vertigo. And I think that's what Isaiah is reflecting in his prophecy. Now, let me finish the history. We'll come back to Isaiah for a moment. So Yotam lives in a moment when internal and external social conditions are changing very rapidly. The first fact that Isaiah is going to notice is that under the prosperity brought by Uzziah, and at least under Yotam's protection, we have the problems in Jerusalem that are the same problems that the prophets Amos and Hosea noticed in the north. The prophets, these were prophets who talked about the internal conditions of the Israelite community. Isaiah is going to bring the same critique to the southern community, to the community in Jerusalem. Fundamentally, he's going to say to them, this is not the kind of city one would have expected where God makes his home. What is required of us? Not simply the sacrifices of the temple, not simply a mouthing of platitudes in affirming the covenant, but a certain kind of social and economic life that bespeaks a godly people. And Isaiah didn't find it in the southern kingdom, and that was the first topic of his castigation, of his prophecy. You have betrayed the covenant because you have betrayed the way of life that the covenant demanded of you. You have pursued the kind of way of life that's actually kind of natural for wealthier societies, a social stratification of the rich and the poor, an oppression of the poor, or rather an opportunism of the rich, using their power to oppress and take advantage and manipulate the poor, and a kind of idolatry, not only of the worship of wealth, but of the worship of other values that have no place in the covenant of Israel. And so that's going to be part of Isaiah's prophecy. That's the first condition of Yotam and his successors. His successor is Ahaz, and his successor is Hizkiyahu, is Hezekiah. That's only part of the problem. Here's the other issue. The other issue is foreign policy. This is the time of the rise of empire. Now, let's go back a moment. I've told you many times that geography is destiny. Geography of the ancient Near East is the story of two great imperial powers. The power of Mesopotamia to the north and the east, the power of Egypt to the south and the west. Whoever controls the highway between Mesopotamia, Iraq, and Egypt controls the known world. David and Solomon were successful kings because the two great empires, Mesopotamia to the north, Egypt to the south, were both in quiescence. They did not have power enough to exert their influence. And so King David could build a regional power. Solomon could extend its boundaries and its trade. And you have within that kingdom, an ideology, a nationalism, a pride. And the pride is we're something special. We're something special because look what we've accomplished. Well, here's what happens. We have in the time of Isaiah, in the 700 BCE, in that century, 8th century, we have the rise of empires, particularly the rise of a northern Mesopotamian empire called Ashur, or Assyria. It's capitaled in a city called Nineveh, made famous in the book of Jonah, which we'll get to later. Today we call that city Mosul. It's in the north of Iraq. And the Assyrians become so very powerful, and it is their ambition to control the highway between north and south. Now that changes the political landscape, because now all of the smaller kingdoms, including ours, have to figure out how do you defend yourself against this giant living in the neighborhood. How do you defend yourself? So there are two major ways of defending yourself. One is to amalgamate with all the other small kingdoms and form an alliance, a sort of bulwark against the Assyrians. And the other is to seek help from the Egyptians. And Judea, the southern kingdom, is going to do both. And that's going to be part of Isaiah's political landscape. And the problem is that Isaiah has a third idea, and something we spoke about last time. Isaiah looks at the political landscape and comes to three basic conclusions. Conclusion number one, he says, there's no way to stop Assyria. You cannot form enough power against Assyria. And the reason you can't form enough power as a bulwark against Assyria is because you're dealing with empire, and empire is power on another scale. It's power on, if you remember, for example, just as a bad example, as a bad analogy, the first or the second Iraq wars, when America went to war against Iraq. And, at first there was this idea that the Revolutionary Guard in Iraq was we went through them, in a matter of days, because America's power is so much more profound than any other power on earth. Well, that's Assyria. I don't mean that as a moral example, just as an analogy. That's Assyria in this moment. And Isaiah sees that there's no way that Judea can stop the Assyrians. So Isaiah's question is the following: if I can't stop them militarily, how do I survive them? How do I survive them? And Isaiah is going to offer an ideology that says our task is not to beat back the Assyrians. Our task is to survive the Assyrians. Now, religiously, his idea is that the Assyrians have been brought by God, that God controls international politics, that all international politics is an expression of the divine will, and that God is coming to punish Jerusalem, just like God punished the northern kingdom of Israel for its infidelity, and God is in charge. That's one way to look at it. A second way to look at it is he says to himself, how do I get my people to survive? And what I need to do is to figure out an ideology, a way of thinking about ourselves, a political identity that enables us to be subjects of the Assyrian emperor without causing our own destruction, so that we can continue to live a covenanted life. And that's going to be his political ideology. Now, that's a very hard ideology to accept, as I talked about last time, because what he's asking you to do fundamentally is surrender. And an ideology of surrender never made friends with anybody. I mean, no one's a fan of surrender because it means giving up our national pride. We all are very proud of sovereignty. But what if sovereignty is a position of vulnerability and surrender turns out to be the only way that you can survive as a culture, even though you have to relinquish much of the material and political power, and most of all your pride, in the face of a power that's much, much, much greater than your own. And that's going to be Isaiah's political position. And there's one more point to this, which is very clever. The reason why one of the reasons why Isaiah believed that this strategy of surrender would work, one of the reasons why, besides the fact that he read the Assyrian emperor as not being interested in owning everybody. The Assyrian emperor doesn't care which god you worship. The Assyrian emperor doesn't care about how you worship your god, whether you keep milchik and fleishik dishes, whether you make Hanukkah or Shabbos. The Assyrian emperor just wants to make sure that you're loyal to him, don't invite enemies into your kingdom, and pay your taxes. Pay your taxes. That's all he cares about. Isaiah perceived this. But there was something else Isaiah perceived. Isaiah perceived that there was a fundamental instability at the heart of the Assyrian Empire. That Assyria was the first great global empire. And that a global empire, by its nature, is going to be unstable because it's very hard to manage many, 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 many lands with many, many, many cultures from an imperial capital far away. Very hard to have a centralized power with satellite conquests and maintain the loyalty of those satellite conquests. Jerusalem, after all, is a long way from Mosul. And that just invites instability. It invites instability. It stretches the supply lines. It stretches the communications lines of this empire far beyond their capacity. Isaiah knows this. And so he's going to take a political position which at the time was terribly, terribly resented, terribly opposed. He's going to say, give up. And people are going to tell him he's a traitor and he's crazy. But Isaiah sees that this is the only way to protect what most important to him, not Israelite sovereignty, but rather Israelite culture, its faith, its monotheism, its meaningfulness. And so let's talk about Isaiah. 3 kinds of prophecy. Number 1, prophecy castigating the internal lives of the life of Israel, castigating the faithlessness to the covenant and to its ethical and social strictures. That's prophecy number 1. Prophecy number 2 is a blatantly political prophecy. Isaiah is going to say to the king, we'll read the story twice. He's going to say, don't fight back. If you fight back against Assyria, you will make yourself a target. They will destroy you. But if you surrender, if you give in, then you can persist as a culture. You can even have a degree of independence. You'll lose the pride, and I dare say this sort of macho, masculine, testosterone-driven need to be in charge, but you'll survive. And then the 3rd kind of prophecy is his vision of tomorrow. We read a little bit of that last week. Isaiah offers the most exquisite vision of tomorrow because he is fundamentally a globalist. He sees the landscape, not just Israel, and he sees God not just as the tribal God of the people Israel. He sees a whole world, and he sees God as the creator of that world and ultimately as the rescuer, the savior of that world. And that's going to be Isaiah's 3 notes in his prophecy. So let's take a look at each of those for a moment today. We'll take a look at castigation, internal castigation, foreign policy, and I'll leave you on a note of hope because right now all of us could use a little bit of hope. So if you have the Bible, come back with me. The first 5 chapters I argued the other day, scholars believe they're trying to figure out why the book of Isaiah begins with the 6th chapter. And if it begins with the 6th chapter, what the heck are the first 5 chapters? And the best suggestion was made that says the first 5 chapters were his most favorite chapters. That Isaiah was putting the book together in his old age, and he sort of said, look, I like these words. So the first 5 chapters of the book of Isaiah are his greatest hits. And then we get his biographical statement in chapter 6. Look at chapter 5 with me. Chapter 5 is a beautiful chapter. Let me sing for my beloved a song for my lover about his vineyard. A vineyard. This is a parable of a vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a fruitful hill. He broke the ground, cleared it of stones, planted it with choice vines, built a watchtower inside of it. He even hewed a wine press in it, for he hoped it would yield grapes. He planted himself a vineyard, a beautiful vineyard. In Israel, they plant vineyards, and in the south of Israel, they plant exquisite vineyards. Good Israeli wine. You should get good Israeli wine, by the way. Instead, it yielded wild grapes. What are wild grapes? Sour grapes. You and I know them, by the way, and I'll tell you how you know them. You're going to laugh when I tell them. They're Concord grapes. What are Concord grapes? The only grapes that grew in North America when Europeans first arrived. So when we got to New York, the only grapes they could find were Concord grapes. They try to make Kiddush wine out of them. Concord grapes are dreadfully sour. So the only way to make wine out of Concord grapes is to dump a lot of sugar in it. And that's where you get Manischewitz. I have nothing against the Manischewitz company. In fact, we have bottles and bottles of it here. But that idea of drinking that sickeningly sweet Concord grape wine, that's where it comes from. Here in Isaiah, it's a curse. It's a weed. It's a weed. He wanted Cabernet Sauvignon, right? He wanted Zinfandel, right? He wanted Semillon. And instead, what did he get? Manischewitz. Now then, dwellers of Jerusalem. So listen to the prophet. He says this story, and now he turns to the dwellers of Jerusalem. He says, dwellers of Jerusalem, men of Judea, you be the judge between me and my vineyard. Right? At first, by the way, notice that he was talking about his friend, and now he's talking about me. And in the translation, me is capitalized, so it's God. What more could have been done for my vineyard that I failed to do? Why, when I hoped it would yield grapes, did it yield wild grapes, sour grapes? Now I'm going to tell you what I'll do to my vineyard. I'll remove its hedge, that it be ravaged. I'll break down its wall, that it may be trampled. I will make it a desolation. It shall not be pruned or hoed. It shall be overgrown with briars and thistles. I'll command the clouds to drop no rain on it. What is he saying? The people of Judea, like the people in northern Israel, believed that they were exempt from the standards of history. They believed that they were God's chosen people and God would always protect them. That God would always protect them, that the covenant between Israel and its God is unconditional. And because it's an unconditional covenant, they could count on God's protection no matter what. And the prophet comes along and says, it's not so. The prophet comes along and says the covenant is a conditional covenant, conditioned on your conduct. And if your conduct is in keeping, it's congruent with the covenant, God will protect you. But if not, I'll remove its hedges and break down its wall, that it be trampled and made a desolation. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the seedling he lovingly tended are the men of Jerusalem, or the people of Judah. He hoped for justice, and behold, there was injustice, for equity, and behold, inequity. Now here we have to ask a question. And it's a question that's being demonstrated right outside my door, because apparently there's a demonstration right out here on our street. Are there rules to history? Are there rules that govern justice and power? And if those rules are violated, are there consequences for the violation of those rules? We'd certainly like to believe that. But when we see social unrest, when we see social strain, when we see the pain of a society, are we courageous and willing enough and honest enough to say, that's the fruit of our own decisions. These are the fruit of our own choices. And that's one of the great questions. Or can we get away with it? Or do we say that the violations weren't that bad? They weren't that bad. I mean, the kinds of excuses and dodges that we all come up with to say, it's not that bad. You know, we tried to do right. We got close enough. He hoped for justice. He got injustice. For equity, and he got iniquity. And now there's a series of castigations, of accusations. Those who add house to house, who join field to field, there's room for none but you to dwell in the land. Who add house to house and field to field. The wealthy get wealthier. And they use the powers of government and the powers of society to manipulate the circumstances so that their wealth grows and the poverty of those who are dispossessed becomes even deeper. So that there's none but you. There's room for none but you. In my hearing, says the Lord of hosts, surely great houses shall lie forlorn, and spacious splendid ones without occupants. For 10 acres of vineyard shall yield one bat, and a field sown with an omer of seed shall yield one ephah. There comes a moment of reckoning. And those who chase liquor early in the morning till late in the evening, inflamed by wine, who at their banquets have lyre and lute and timbrel, flute and wine, who never give a thought to the plan of the Lord and take no note of what he is designing, assuredly my people will suffer exile. There's a sort of notion of measure for measure here, because you manipulated the circumstances to increase your own wealth, your wealth will be taken. And because you had no sense that God has a plan in history, you'll become the victims of that plan in history. And he goes through all of these various these castigations. Jump with me over to verse 18. Those who haul sin with cords of falsehood and iniquity as a cart with ropes. Beautiful phrase. And look at 20. Those who call evil good and good evil. This is something that we've talked about many times. The manipulation of political language, of moral language. The manipulation of language. George Orwell wrote much about this. The way in which, Arbeit macht frei, work makes you free, the words over the gate at Auschwitz, the manipulation of language, so that what was once evil becomes now good, and good becomes evil, and there's no moral judgment to be applied because there's no moral language left that we can share with each other. As light as darkness, those who present darkness as light and light as darkness, bitter as sweet and sweet as bitter, those who are so wise that their opinions so clever in their own judgments. There's no listening. There's no sense. So this is his castigation. He looks into a society where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. He looks into a society and he says, this can't go on. There's coming a reckoning. And the reckoning will undo all of the achievements of this society. This is his internal critique, which is reminiscent of the critique of Amos and Hosea in the northern kingdom. Isaiah's the first one in the southern kingdom, after Elijah, of course, to shout these accusations at the people of Judea. Let's turn now to the second of his themes. The second of his themes are his political themes. And here he's going to talk about foreign policy. And what's interesting here is that he's playing a role. He's sort of he's playing a role where he becomes a national security advisor to the king. But his advice is so different than the conventional advice. So let's look at this one. The other one I want to look at another time is what happened to Hezekiah. But let's look at chapter 7 now. So if you'll skip over chapter 6 and look at chapter 7. In the reign of Ahaz, son of Yotam, son of Uzziah, king of Judah, King Rezin of Aram and King Pekach of Remaliah of Israel, son of Remaliah of Israel, marched upon Jerusalem to attack it, but they're not able to attack it. So what happened? Assyria is rising, and the northern kingdom of Israel forms an alliance with Aram, which is the other local kingdom. A number of kings gathered together to form an alliance against the Assyrians. And they demand that Judea, that Jerusalem, join the alliance. But the king is unready to join the alliance. So in order to get the king to join the alliance, the first thing that the alliance does is invade Judea. And what they're coming to do is either force the king, Yotam, to join the alliance, or they'll replace him with a king of their choice, with a puppet, who will help join the alliance and stand against Assyria. Isaiah says, don't join the alliance and don't stand against Assyria. Now, when it was reported to the house of David, that's the southern kingdom, that Aram had allied itself with Ephraim, their hearts and the hearts of their people tremble as a forest swayed before the wind. But the Lord said to Isaiah, go with your son and meet Ahaz at the end of the upper pool by the road of the fuller's field, and say to him, be firm and calm, do not be afraid and do not lose heart on account of those two smoking stubs of firebrands, on account of the raging of Rezin and the Aramean son of Remaliah and the son of Remaliah, because the Arameans with Ephraim and the son of Remaliah have plotted against you, saying, we'll march against Judah and invade and conquer, and we'll set up as king the son of Tubael, and say to the Lord, it will not succeed, it will not come to pass. Don't join the alliance. Because if you join the alliance, says Isaiah, you will make yourself a target of the Assyrians. The Assyrians do not want to destroy you. The most they want to do is take tribute. The most they want to do is have a cut of the action of the caravan trade that comes through here, but they have no interest in destroying this kingdom. But if you make yourself a target, they will destroy you. It shall not succeed, it shall not come to pass. The alliance's invasion. This is beginning to sound like the first 2 episodes of Star Wars, with alliances and empires. For the chief of Aram is Damascus, and the chief of Damascus is Rezin, and the city chief of Ephraim is Samaria, and that's my dog, and he doesn't like Isaiah. And in another 75 years, Ephraim shall be shattered as a people. If you will not believe, you cannot be trusted. God says, go and tell the king, don't join the alliance. So what happens? How do you tell a king? that a huge empire is coming to conquer you, and I don't want you to join the resistance. How do you tell that king? The Lord spoke further as for a sign, right? He asks him for a sign, but he asks for his ask for a sign. The Lord spoke to Ahaz through he's speaking to Ahaz the king, son of Yotam, through Isaiah. Ask for a sign from the Lord your God, anywhere down to Sheol or up to the sky. So the prophet goes to the king and he says, don't join the alliance. You're not going to be destroyed. The alliance will not destroy you, and the Assyrians will not destroy you. And the king says, what are you, crazy? We're going to die. And the king says, no. And the prophet says, no, just ask for a sign. Pick a card, any card. But Ahaz replied, I will not ask. I will not test the Lord. He's got a little menschlichkeit. Listen, house of David, Isaiah retorted, is it not enough for you to treat men as helpless that you treat my God as helpless? Come on, ask for a sign. I'll give you a sign. I'll show you that this is going to happen. Assuredly, my Lord will give you a sign of his own accord. All right, you won't ask? I'll give you one. You ready? Look, the young woman is with child and about to give birth to a son. Let her name him Emmanuel. By the time he learns to reject bad and the good, people will be feeding on curds and honey. For before the lad knows to reject the bad and choose the good, the ground whose two kings you dread shall be abandoned. The Lord will cause to come upon you and your people and your ancestral house such days that have never come since Ephraim turned away from Judah, the selfsame king of Assyria. There's a young woman in a kingdom. Some scholars say it's his daughter, the daughter of the king. She's pregnant. She's going to have a child. She's going to name the kid Emmanuel. And I promise you, says the prophet, that you will dance at his bar mitzvah. You are so worried that these two kings, Aram and Israel, are going to destroy you. And you're so worried that behind them comes the Assyrian Empire and they're going to destroy you. Nonsense. This woman will give birth to a kid. His name will be Emmanuel, and you will dance at his bar mitzvah. You will see this will not come to be. That's his sign. Now, just as a sidelight, this is a digression now. This is one of the verses that became important to the later Christian community. The phrase in Hebrew is alma. Alma means a young woman. All over the Bible, alma means a young woman. It's only when they translated the Bible into Greek in the Septuagint that alma was translated as virgin. It doesn't mean virgin in the sense that a woman has never had relations with a man. It doesn't mean virgin as a woman who's not married to him. It just means young woman. Alma means, if it were virgin, it would be bitula, but it's alma. But the early church wanted to create the story of the virgin birth of Christ. And so they took this verse as a prediction of the coming of Christ. If you've ever gotten approached by people who are deeply Pentecostal or evangelical Christians, this is one of the verses they say, look, see, in the Hebrew Bible, Jesus is coming. Jesus' birth is already predicted. And you can point out two things. One, the word alma does not mean virgin, it means young woman. But tula is the word for virgin. And number two, his name is Emmanuel, not Joshua, not Jesus. And they will have an excuse for that too, but it's clear that that's not the context of the verse, the meaning of the verse. The meaning of the verse is a demonstration to Ahaz, the king of Judah, that he doesn't have to join this alliance. It's an assurance. And that what happens is, sure enough, the two kings withdraw, the forces of the alliance withdraw, and the northern kingdom is going to be destroyed just as Isaiah predicted it would be. That's one piece of foreign policy. So now the question is, we are living in an age of empire, and we are a small kingdom, and we are looking for ways of surviving the onslaught of empire. If you can't join the local alliance, what's the other alternative? Join Egypt. Join the Egyptians. Isaiah hates that idea. He says, because if you join the Egyptians and you think the Egyptians, first of all, the Egyptians aren't going to help you because for them, there's no profit in this. And if they do come, they will destroy you. They will make you their slave. He hates the Egyptians. Now, we're not talking about Egyptians from the Moses story. This is the Egyptians in the 8th century. So turn with me for a moment to chapter 30, 30. And take a look with me at chapter 30. This is Isaiah. O disloyal sons, declares the Lord, making plans against my wishes, weaving schemes against my will, therefore piling guilt on guilt, who set out to go down to Egypt without asking me, to seek refuge with Pharaoh, to seek shelter under the protection of Egypt. The refuge with Pharaoh shall result in your shame, the shelter under Egypt's protection in your chagrin. Though his officers are present in Zoan, though his messengers reach as far as Hanes, they shall come to shame because of a people that does not avail them. There is no avail or help, brings only chagrin and disgrace. Don't ally with the Egyptians. They will betray you, I promise you. Now turn to chapter 31. Ready? 31. Ha! I think ha is translated as oi, Those who go down to Egypt for help and rely on horses, they have put their trust in the abundance of chariots and the vast numbers of riders, and they have not turned to the Holy One of Israel. They have not sought the Lord, but he is too wise. He has brought on misfortune, has not canceled his word. He shall rise against the house of evildoers and the allies of the workers of iniquity. For the Egyptians are man, not God, and their horses are flesh, not spirit. And when the Lord stretches out his arm, the helper shall trip and the help shall fall, and both shall perish together. For thus the Lord has said, as lion, great beast, growls over its prey, and when shepherds gather in force against him, is not dismayed by their cries, nor cowed by their noise. So the Lord will descend to make war against the mount and the hill of Zion. Don't trust the Egyptians. Don't trust the Egyptians. They will betray you. And if you trust the Egyptians, you will end up as their vassals and as their slaves, and you will be betrayed. You will be betrayed. So this is Isaiah's political philosophy. His political philosophy is, if you ally and try to stop the Assyrians, you're going to be destroyed. You're going to be destroyed. The question is, what do you do? And his answer is surrender sovereignty, surrender militarily, give up, and accept the fact that God rules history, and this isn't your time to be sovereign. And accept a new identity as a faith community that is no longer tied to political sovereignty. Now, this is hard for us to hear today, but listen carefully. This is the arc of Jewish history. From Isaiah to Jeremiah, and we'll see that to Yochanan ben Zakkai of the Mishnah, through the 1800 years of Jewish diaspora, this was our philosophy. We chose not to be a sovereign people because we understood that without sovereignty, we have the possibility of surviving under a different identity. We can be a faith community. So we can live in every country of the world under practically any government that allows us to learn Torah. That was our strategy. A feather on the wind, flotsam and jetsam on the sea, without asking for material power. We will live by spiritual power. We'll live by spiritual power. That is the power of our commitment to covenant and commitment to God and commitment to a way of life. It worked. That's why we're here. But what happened was, at the end of the 19th century, another prophet is going to rise. His name is Theodor Herzl. And he's going to recognize that at the end of the 19th century, something has radically changed in the nature of world politics. And it's no longer possible for the Jewish people to live without material power. We have to return to sovereignty, and we have to return to power, because it's the only way to save ourselves from this new reality of national and racist anti-Semitism. The only way to save ourselves. And the problem was that he was right. And in 1897, he said this: and if we had found a way to return to sovereignty at Herzl's behest, the Holocaust might not have been either might not have happened or might not have been as bad. But unfortunately, we didn't achieve his dream until 1948, which meant it cost 6 million lives to prove that he was right. That racial anti-Semitism no longer gives us the possibility of living as a people without sovereignty, as a people without freedom, as a people without power. And the lesson, the bitter, bitter, bitter lesson of the 20th century is that Jews can no longer live without power. Whether it's power in the land of Israel as sovereign people, or whether it's power in the United States and other countries as participants, as full and active participants in liberal democracies where we can shape policy to protect ourselves, we can no longer afford to close our eyes to what goes on outside our doors and live without power. One more story. Then I'll leave you with a note of hope. So I was going to do this next week, but we also do it now. So jump with me to the end of this story, which you'll find in chapter 36. Now, this is ironic, strange, because this story is repeated twice in the Bible. It's here, and it's also in the book of 2 Kings. So Uzziah is the king when Isaiah is born. His son Yotam becomes king on the day Isaiah becomes a prophet. Yotam gives way to Ahaz. He's the guy that Isaiah says, don't join the alliance. When Ahaz dies, his son Hezekiah, becomes king. Hezekiah is a righteous king. The Bible loves him. But Hezekiah lives in the worst of times. The Assyrians have risen and become very aggressive. They have come to the north of Israel. And in the north of Israel, they have come to, they're destroyed the north of Israel. The Sumerians allied with all the other, this is the year 720. 20 years into Isaiah's career, 20 years after chapter 6. The northern kingdom of Samaria allies with all the other kingdoms, and they put a bulwark against Assyria, and Assyria smashes them. And then Assyria comes to Israel, to Judea, to Jerusalem, and encircles Jerusalem and demands its surrender. And King Hezekiah doesn't know what to do. Should I fight? Should I surrender? What should I do? Chapter 36 in Isaiah. In the 14th year of King Hezekiah, King Sennacherib of Assyria marched against the fortified towns of Judah and seized them from Lachish. King of Assyria sent Rabshakeh, that's his Secretary of State, with a large force to King Hezekiah. Rabshakeh took a position at the upper pool. That's where the kings meet, at the upper pool. Rabshakeh said to them, tell Hezekiah, the great king, the king of Assyria, what makes you so confident? Mere talk makes counsel and valor for war. Look on whom you are reveling and rebelled against me. You are relying on Egypt, the splintered reed of a staff. That's what the Pharaoh, king of Egypt, is like to all. Basically, Rabshakeh says to them, surrender or you die. Surrender or you die. What should they do? Should they fight? Should they ally with Egypt and fight back? Should they surrender? What should they do? Turn the page. Turn to chapter 37. King Hezekiah heard this. He rent his clothes and covered himself in sackcloth and sent Elkiam, covered with sackcloth, to the prophet Isaiah, son of Amoz. Now, it's wonderful that the king, in a moment of stress, calls on Isaiah. Because Isaiah has a very different relationship to the king than other prophets have with their kings. You'll see that Jeremiah has a very different relationship. Isaiah is a friend of the king. He's an advisor to the king. And they said to him, thus says Isaiah, this is a day of distress and chastisement and disgrace. The babies have reached the birth stool, but the strength to give birth is lacking. Perhaps the Lord your God will take note of the words of Rabshakeh, whom the master king of Egypt, whom his master, the king of Assyria, has sent to blaspheme the living God and mete out judgment. And King Hezekiah's ministers came to Isaiah. Isaiah said to them, tell your master as follows. This is verse number 6, chapter 37, Isaiah. Thus says the Lord God, do not be frightened by the words of blasphemy against me that you've heard from the minions of the king of Assyria. I will delude him. He will hear a rumor and return to his land. I will make him fall by the sword in his land. Don't do anything. Don't surrender. Don't fight back. Certainly don't seek alliances. When Rabshakeh heard, right, he says, tell this to the king, verse 10, do not let your God on whom you're relying mislead you into thinking that Jerusalem will not be delivered into the hands of King Hezekiah, the king of Assyria. You yourself heard what the kings have done to the lands, how they've annihilated them. You think you can escape? So the Assyrians say, we want your surrender now. Give up the city, give up its treasures, give up your king. Give up your king. That's how you conquer the land. They were going to kill Hezekiah. And Isaiah says, nope. Now, just a moment. If you were Hezekiah, what would you do? Would you listen to this prophet who tells you don't do anything? Would you listen to the ambassador, the Secretary of State, Rabshakeh, of the king of Assyria, who tells you, surrender and I'll save your life? You live as an exile, but you live? Or do you listen to the militants in your own government who say, send messengers to the Egyptians and we'll fight back against these Assyrians? Who would you listen to? And I'm really tempted to close the broadcast and tell you to wait till next week, but I won't do that to you because I hate programs like that. Here's what happens. Hezekiah is a man of deep faith in God. Verse 14, chapter 37. Hezekiah received the letter from the messengers and he read it, and he went up to the house of the Lord and he spread it out before the Lord, and Hezekiah prayed to the Lord and he said, Lord of hosts, enthroned on the cherubim, whose presence is on the ark of the covenant. You alone are God, King, God of all the kingdoms of the earth. You made heaven and earth. O Lord, incline your ear and hear, open your eyes and see. Hear all the words that Sennacherib has sent to blaspheme the living God. True, O Lord, the kings of Assyria have annihilated all the nations and their lands, and have committed their gods to the flames and destroyed them, for they are not gods, but man's handiwork. But now, O Lord our God, deliver us from his hands, and let all the kingdoms of the earth know that you, O Lord, alone are God. Right? And then Isaiah sends back a message saying, don't do it. Fair maiden Zion despises you, he says to the Assyrians. She mocks you. Fair Jerusalem shakes her head at you. Who have you blasphemed and reviled? So I assume that what we're reading here is not the news report. I assume that what we're reading here is a telling of these events written generations later, probably from documents left behind, because it reads like a script. It reads like a cantata, right? It reads like a cantata with these wonderful soliloquies, because I don't imagine they really had time for soliloquies, and I don't imagine anybody really took down what Hezekiah said in the temple at that moment of his distress. So somebody wrote this down later and gave us this beautiful political cantata of what happened on that day. So let's see what happened. I know you want to know the end. So go to the end. Chapter 37, right? Chapter 37, verse 33. Assuredly, thus says the Lord concerning the king of Assyria. He shall not enter this city. He shall not shoot an arrow at it, or advance upon it with a shield, or pile up a siege mound against it. He shall go back the way he came. He shall not enter the city, declares the Lord. I will protect and save the city for my sake, and for my sake, and for the sake of my servant David. Would you believe him? And here's the end. That night, an angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 of the Assyrian camp, and the following morning they were all dead corpses. King Sennacherib of Assyria broke camp and retreated and stayed in Nineveh. And while he was worshiping in the temple of his god Nisroch, he was struck down by the sword of his sons, and they fled to the land of Ararat, and his son Saradan succeeded him as king. Sounds like the Game of Thrones. That night, with the whole Assyrian army camped on his front yard, God sent a plague, and it killed them all. And what happened in the end? Sennacherib went back to Assyria, and when he was davening in his temple, his sons killed him, and another son became king. What really happened? What really happened was that the coup d'etat, the two sons of Sennacherib pulled off a coup back in Nineveh. They crowned themselves kings of the Assyrian Empire, and the Assyrian king heard about it and decided that he could leave Jerusalem. He didn't need Jerusalem, went back to save his kingdom. That's what happened. How did Isaiah know that? Did Isaiah have insider information of what was going on back in Nineveh? Did Isaiah believe that God would really protect, in some way, God would protect Jerusalem? Did Isaiah really understand the deep instability of the Assyrian Empire and realize that one way or the other, the Assyrians were not going to pull this off? Who knows? But that's the story. And what we have in these two chapters is the illustration of his philosophy. If Israel is prepared to step away from sovereignty and accept its role as a peripheral political kingdom, it will achieve its role as the central actor in the spiritual drama of Western culture. And that's what happened. We lost all of our political power, became the most powerful people in Western culture. We shaped the thought, along with the Greeks, of course, we shaped the thought and moral life of Western culture. And that's Isaiah. Next week, we'll take one more peek at Isaiah, and then we're going to take a look at the very next prophet, who's the prophet Jeremiah. I hope that you'll stay well tonight. Apparently in Los Angeles County, the curfew is 9 o'clock. But please, wherever you are, be careful. And be careful to wear your mask outside, and be careful to take care of your families. And I hope to see all of you soon. Friday night, Valley Beth Shalom joins with Sinai Temple in a community prayer service for hope and healing. Shabbos morning, of course, we'll be davening together here at VBS, and Havdalah Saturday night. Next week, Lunch and Learn again on Wednesday at 12:30. Tonight, if you'd like to join me at 7 o'clock, my guest in the Rabbi study is a dear friend, Professor Mark Dollinger of San Francisco State University, author of a remarkable book called Black Power in Jewish Politics. We'll be talking about the long historical relationship between African Americans and the American Jewish community and what really happened. As well, Mark was involved in a landmark lawsuit against the university, making sure that Jewish kids on his campus and campuses across the country have a right to live as Jewish kids and not be afraid, especially when they speak out as Zionists. So you'll hear that tonight, 7 o'clock on the Valley Beth Shalom page on Facebook. Take good care.